Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world. With self-care strategies from Chinese medicine, functional medicine, Ayurveda, neuroscience, and beyond. I'm your host, Brody Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and transformation catalyst, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Brody Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and a holistic self-care strategist. And I'm really excited for today's show because mining the wisdom traditions for what is most useful in our modern world has pretty much been my life's work, as it has been for my guest today, Rick Hanson. Rick's teachings have been informing my work with clients for well over a decade, and I'm thrilled to be talking with him today about the intersection of brain science and practices for personal evolution and cultivating happiness. Rick Hanson is a Ph.D., a psychologist, a senior fellow at UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center, and a New York Times bestselling author with a keen interest in the brain and meditation. His books have been published in 29 languages and include Neuordharma, Resilient, Hardwiring Happiness, Buddha's Brain, Just One Thing, and Mother Nurture. He's lectured at NASA, Google, Oxford, and Harvard, and taught in meditation centers worldwide. His work has been featured on the BBC, CBS, NPR, and he has 150,000 subscribers reading his Just One Thing newsletter every week. But most importantly, he's been meditating since 1974. His latest book, Neuordharma, teaches us how to handle stress, heal old pain, feel at ease with others, and rest in the sense of our own natural goodness. Rick Hanson, welcome to A Healthy Curiosity.
Brody, I'm really glad to be here. And as we were joking earlier, part of, I'm sure, our conversation will be about how to deal with challenges. And one of the challenges is that I'm doing this from a recording studio in my home, and a neighbor, a nice neighbor, is pounding nails or something, 20 feet away. So people might be hearing that in the background, but they could just think of that as sort of the drum beat, for the soundtrack for our conversation.
I love it. It's really all in the framing. It can be an annoying distraction or not. It could be the soundtrack.
That's right.
Fantastic. So I'd love for people who may not be familiar with your work to give us a background on how you got started on this fusion of neuroscience and meditation.
Well, I've always been interested in the deep causes of anything and the deep source of our happiness, the deep sources of our suffering. And that took me initially into the human potential movement, and then that segued into a formal license as a clinical psychologist. But along the way, I was very interested in what the contemplative traditions of the world had to say, particularly the Eastern ones that kind of drew my heart. In particular, the original early teachings of the Buddha, which are very psychological, very penetrating, and actually quite radical in wonderful and useful ways. So that's the second thing, the contemplative wisdom part, in addition to the Western psychology part. And then along came brain science. I've always been interested in the underlying physical embodied basis for this moment of consciousness, right? But there wasn't that much that was known until starting around 20 years ago. So in the last 20 or so years, there's just been an explosion of understanding of how the nervous system is really functioning in the phrase as an enchanted loom, continually weaving the tapestry of consciousness. So when you put those three together, you put together Western psychology, Eastern contemplative practice, and hardcore brain science, sparks fly. It's full of useful ideas and full of useful, skillful means, which is what my new book's about, really skillful means of practice, to gradually embody the underlying basis of a fundamental contentment, inner peace, wisdom, and love. And that just seems like so good, right? Both for dealing with a neighbor who's banging on their fence and also for the higher reaches of human potential.
I really appreciate your use of the word embody, because it really is. I mean, it's because there's a difference between the brain and the mind, right? There's a difference between like our
thoughts and things.
thoughts and things, and we have these different layers of who we are, and they influence one another. There's a physical basis that is the ground for our consciousness arising, and yet it's not determinative. It's not like we just have this brain and we're just subject to, it functions differently than like our heart or our lungs, for example, and there's a feedback loop. So I'd love for you to unpack a little bit of, first of all, the difference between the brain and the mind.
Oh, yeah.
And I love how in the book you talk about the mind shaping the brain, shaping the mind. So you can just walk us through that a little bit. That'd be lovely.
Well, first, just to respect the depth of the question. I mean, this is Descartes, the mind-body problem. I mean, people have been banging on this forever. It starts to get into questions of, is there anything besides the ordinary Big Bang universe? Is there a God, right? Are there supernatural processes? I guess it's a deep question. For me, I kind of start with the squirrels in my backyard. These golden squirrels, I look at them, they have eyes, they have ears. We understand how their nervous system works. And I would say clearly they're having experiences. They're not zombies. There is hearing, there is seeing. They are having basic emotions. I can see their tails wag in frustration when a big turkey comes into my backyard and stands over the pile of birdseed that squirrel really wants, but the turkey is bigger and it's not going to, the squirrel's not going to get the seed. So it's frustrated. It's feeling things, right? The experiences those squirrels are having are natural, and they are being fundamentally produced and entwined with life altogether, but locally. For that particular golden squirrel, they're being produced in a brain roughly the size of a walnut. And our experiences are being produced by a brain that's probably, 10 or 50 times bigger than that walnut. I haven't done the math. And yet there is a kinship. There is a natural basis for the experiences we're having. I think for many people, that is powerful to really appreciate. That while we can be experientially mindful of the body, that we really are grounded in matter. We're really grounded in life. Really. I think, honestly, I've been in the self-help New Age world, human potential, for a long time. I think there's a lot of rhetoric about embodiment, but a resistance to actually honoring and being humble about the fundamental implications of that. What the Buddha talked about a long time ago is dependent origination. In other words, consciousness, our experiences, which is a term I prefer. It's less kind of freighted with implications as consciousness. But our experiences, as best we know, absolutely require, a necessary condition for our experiences: hearing, seeing, wanting, loving, remembering, including fairly subtle experiences, require underlying hardware. Now, whether the hardware of the body is sufficient for the experiences of a squirrel or for Brody or Rick right now, that's a very deep matter. My own view is that there are supernatural factors and transcendental matters that are meaningfully distinct from the natural, ordinary Big Bang universe, the one we occupy, the one that our bodies are matter, matter and energy together. They're an aspect of. But on the other hand, I'm quite comfortable working within the natural frame, it's called, in a secular frame, and take into account what we know already about how the body operates and how the mind-body process co-arises and co-occurs, with causes flowing in both ways, so that the mind doesn't just reduce mechanistically to the body. The mind influences the body, the flow of experiences, the flow of thoughts, the flow of intentions, enlist neural activity to proceed, but they have causal power of their own. I'm perfectly content to function inside the natural universe as a therapist and as a neuropsychologist. But that said, my ultimate model is that there are mysteries that are beyond ordinary reality.
Absolutely. And yet it seems like as we understand those mysteries more and more, there's still, it doesn't necessarily negate them, that,
Yeah.
that as we can stay within this framework. In Chinese medicine, there really isn't a distinction between the mind and the body. It's all qi, it's all energy. And
Mm.
there is, certain kinds of energy that are going to engender that are going to affect either the body or the mind in various ways. And we can talk about these dimensions of consciousness.
Yeah, I
Um,
should just add that my wife
yeah.
is a licensed acupuncturist in
Oh,
California,
great.
has a background there. And I have a lot of respect for Chinese medicine. I would say that as best we know, rocks are not having thoughts. you know,
True. Yes.
they're matter without mind, right? And so, okay, great. Okay, good. So let's keep going. This is super. It's great hanging out with
Absolutely.
you already.
Agreed. Agreed. So, well, I'm curious why this book now?
Oh, great. Well, I think throughout history, people have longed in their heart and they've had an intuition of a fundamental kind of inner peace and contentment and ease. I think there's a phrase in the Buddhist tradition, the sure heart's release. There's some longing in that for us. And we now have the ability to kind of reverse engineer enlightenment, to think about, I'm going to use a kind of charged term maybe, but the hardware of enlightenment. What is the underlying basis in the brain of awakening? Isn't that a cool question? I think that's a cool question.
Absolutely. A very cool question. And it's a question that I know people are addressing in various ways, like the biohacker community, or that
Yeah.
is like looking at brain waves and looking at
Mm-hmm.
how can we maybe shortcut
Yeah.
having decades of meditation into just moments. So it
Yeah.
seems like your book is after the same thing. Like, what can we do in a very practical way? That what are the teachings that have been around in Buddhism for quite some time? How can we
Mhm.
actually make these useful to us in our daily lives?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so for myself, I would say I'm a methods guy, not a theory guy. And what I mean by that is that taking a nod from my own root teacher, the Buddha himself, he was interested in what was true, but he was mostly interested in what worked.
Yes,
He
exactly.
was
It's
very
a very
practical.
pragmatic. Yes.
Exactly, exactly. So when we look at people who seem to be far along in their practice throughout history, the sages and saints, the great teachers, people alive today, some of them famous, most of them not well known, and yet you look at them and you go, "Wow, I'd like some of that." If you want to get good at anything, study people who are really good at it. If you want to get good at making lasagna, study people who have a great lasagna recipe, or play tennis really well, or are a very admirable parent, or seem to be very skillful in their marriage or their primary relationship, say. We observe them. I've done a lot of rock climbing, and I'll watch people who are better climbers and then imagine my way into feeling in my own body what they're doing. So we, in effect, reverse engineer it. And what I think we find in people who are awakened or close to it are seven fundamental ways of being that are accessible to everyone and which get developed to the point of perfection at the pinnacle of human possibility. So these seven qualities are what my book focuses on in a really practical way, grounded in the latest brain science to develop. So I'll just name them kind of quickly here if it's okay.
Please. Yeah.
Yeah, the first quality is steadiness of mind. So I turn all these ways of being into practices, so I'll describe them that way. So steadying the mind. How can we sustain stable presence, stable mindfulness, and in fact, develop concentration power in our own mind so that we begin to have more and more of a penetrating laser like focus into the nature of consciousness, the nature of experiences, and a laser like focus that actually leads to deep meditative absorptions or deep experiences that are very revelatory, steadying the mind.
Laser like focus. I'm sure I can almost hear people laughing, like, oh, yeah, because our modern world does not necessarily
Yeah,
allow for depth and
that's right.
single focus,
Yeah.
where it seems like that with the speed of life and with so many balls that most of us have in the air that we're
Yeah.
juggling, it can be it can feel really elusive to, I think about like the garden sprinkler of attention going
Mm-hmm.
everywhere in all directions, and it can feel really chaotic. And that, so for a lot of people, like just the idea of mindfulness or as you put it, studying the mind as a
Mm-hmm.
first step, that in and of itself can feel so elusive.
That's right. But what is clear is that with brief practices and sometimes longer ones, people really can develop this. In other words, people really can, despite our culture,
Yes.
develop a stability of present moment awareness so that, unlike the average person in research, their mind is not wandering half the time. Their mind is still wandering maybe 10% of the time. I think that's, not unreasonable, but 90% of the time, boom, they're just dropped in. And what that chapter of the book explores, grounded in research on the brain, is how we can actually cultivate that kind of steadiness of mind. So then, to keep going,
Yes.
want me to keep going with the other six? Or
I do. I definitely want to talk about all of them. And I would love for that to be the bulk of what we explore today. But
Mhm.
I'd love to know a little bit more about like that steadiness of mind
Okay.
isn't enough, right? You call out that it isn't enough to just have focused attention, and that like
Right.
it seems like it's like the first crucible, or like it's the keys in the ignition, that it's hard to do other work on yourself without having basic steadiness, and like the ability to point the laser in the direction that we want it to
That's
go.
right.
And so it seems like, do I have this right, that steadiness of mind is step one?
Yep. Of seven.
Okay, great.
That's right.
And then we move on to the next practice, which you refer to as warming the heart.
Yeah, exactly right. So, and again, these are ways of being we see in people who are really far along. And if we were to ask ourselves, okay, how would you describe what it's like to be you when you're really, really at your best? Whatever that time was, by the seashore, at the end of a meditation retreat, the day your child was born, whatever it might be, what's going on when you're at your best, when you're as happy and wise, loving and strong as you can ever be? Right. And I think we would say, okay, I was quite steady in my attention. I wasn't highly distracted. I wasn't scattered all over the place, steadiness of mind. And also, second, my heart was open. It was warm. I was compassionate. I was kind. I was benevolent. I was loving. I was interested in justice, not just for myself. I expanded the circle of us to include more and more of them. So these are aspects of warming the heart. And here too, we can develop this quality in ourselves. I find it actually really interesting, especially these days in a highly kind of politicized and somewhat and polarized environment, to be able to be rested in a lovingness while simultaneously speaking truth to power and really sticking up for social justice without letting hatred and vengeance poison our heart. That's a real practice, right? That's a development, but that's under the heading here of warming the heart.
I love that. And
Yeah.
when I was reading this part of the book, what there you have a series of questions that, and the
Hmm.
question that stood out for me is, have I been killing anything alive within me?
Mm.
Like I really,
Yeah.
that just got me, because I am someone who tends to be rather self-critical, and that
Mm.
that listeners of the show will have been on the journey with me of self-compassion and
Yeah.
making peace with the inner critic. I know that's something that a lot of listeners share, is that the tendency to be way more kind outwardly than we can
Yeah.
inwardly. And I'm wondering if you have, and just another just personal practice thing is that in my exploration of trying to be more inwardly compassionate, changing the way that I'm meditating, from a focus practice, that can
Mm.
be sort of mantra oriented or breath oriented, and changing that to being a more loving kindness meditation of coming down into my heart center and
Yeah.
letting that dominate for a while. What I spend some time with, I've really noticed has helped me shift into softness.
That's beautiful.
I'm wondering if you have a favorite practice for helping people get into drop the self criticism.
Right. Well, so in the kind of general bucket of practices of warming the heart. There's certainly a moral dimension. The Buddha called it sila, restraint. It's a fundamental dimension. There's no replacement for a moral attitude. And also, self-compassion is in that chapter as well, just like you're saying. So one of my favorite practices, you want to do it? Let's do
Sure.
it.
Let's
Okay,
do it.
it's 3 breaths, all right? And obviously people can take more time with this. And if they're listening, you can do it along with us. And so in the first breath, just feel the breath in your body as a whole, torso and body as a whole, one breath. And then in the second breath, bring to mind one or more beings that you care about and rest in the feeling of caring while being aware of breathing. Caring includes liking, compassion, love, friendliness. Okay. And then in the third breath, bring to mind the feeling of being with someone who cares about you. And focus on the feeling of being liked, included, seen, or even loved. Okay. 3
Oh,
breaths.
that's so lovely. That's so lovely. Thank you.
Yeah. And you could take a little more time with each one of them. And the key is to use the prompts of bringing to mind or feeling like you're being with or the memory of, just as a way into the experience. It's not about getting preoccupied with the story or the complications or what you
It
wish was
seems like
different.
it's like the feeling tone that we're
Yeah.
trying to we're conjuring up that feeling, and it's like that drop of dye that colors the water of
Yeah,
our
that's right.
of our sort of mind body aura.
Yeah,
All
the
of
felt
that.
sense. That's exactly right. The feeling, and then in effect in your brain. And there's a lot in the book that's about moving from states to traits. In other words, how do we help experiences leave lasting physical residues behind in the nervous system so that increasingly we develop trait mindfulness, trait compassion, trait gratitude. And one key way to do it is to start with experiences that are rich and then marinate in them for kind of a breath or
Yes.
longer.
Amplifying them with our attention, right? This is
Yeah.
this is one of those teachings that where our attention goes, energy flows, right? That we can intentionally add detail and richness from our sensory
That's right.
experience to help fill it out, because our brain tends to remember the stuff that stands out, right?
That's right. The point is the cultivation of lasting, durable qualities of mind and heart that are with us wherever we go.
Let's move on to the third practice
Sure.
of resting in fullness.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite because it gets at for me, the fundamental fulcrum of Buddhist practice, which is moving from the second to the third noble truth, from craving to not craving. And from a neuropsychological standpoint, why do we crave? Well, we crave as animals, squirrels or humans, and crave in its subtle forms, pushing away what's unpleasant, chasing after what's pleasant, clinging to what's heartfelt. We do that on the basis of an underlying sense of something missing or something wrong. Craving is a drive state. And so, if you increasingly cultivate the sense of fullness and balance rather than deficit and disturbance, something missing, something wrong, the underlying basis for craving begins to disappear. And you're more and more able to rest in the present with equanimity that is not numb or blank, but rather is suffused with a sense of contentment, love, and inner peace. And that's what that chapter is about.
I really appreciate the fact that the wanting of something is the not having it, right? So when we're spending time in craving, when we spend our time thinking that like, oh, I need this thing, or like I'll
Yeah,
be okay when I have chocolate or success in my career, or whatever it is that you're thinking about as the thing that you're wanting, it's fundamentally not focusing on the battle becomes like, how do I get this? Or like, oh, you shouldn't have it, or that kind of thing, as opposed to just opting out of that entirely and focusing on the presence of what you do
Mm.
have, being content, being peaceful with what is, maybe even just that resting in fullness as the antidote for feeling like you're not whole unless.
Yeah, exactly right. And what gets really interesting is to have this increasingly unshakable core of resilient well being that is in the background of your awareness, sometimes in the foreground, to have that increasingly stable in you, increasingly established and cultivated based on durable changes in your brain. And then, on the basis of that, manage the challenges of life, including pursuing your wholesome aspirations. The issue is not desire per se. The issue is our relationship to desire and the objects of desire. So I really, I'm a motivated, playful, exploratory person. I'm interested in this life, and I have certain ambitions, and I have certain moral commitments, wholesome desires that children be fed. Wow. That's a low bar, right? But we still haven't yet crossed that bar as a species altogether. So, how do we aspire without attachment, right? How do you dream big dreams and swing for the fences while feeling already full? That's great exploration. And that's also part of that chapter.
And yeah, I'm compelled. I need to go back and reread that chapter.
Yeah.
And then we move on to being wholeness,
Yeah.
having to do
So,
with self-acceptance.
yeah. So the way I kind of clustered these, and again, underlining the point that everyone can have an experience of this, right? We can start with a taste, and then we can increasingly develop it to the point of really perfection, if you will, at the very pinnacle of enlightenment. But the first three hang together: steadiness, lovingness, and fullness. And you kind of feel it. Okay. Stable attention, mindful, with a warm and loving heart, with emotional balance amidst the waves of life. Steadiness, lovingness, and fullness.
That
That's
makes
good.
so
That's a
much
good
sense.
package.
Absolutely. You're not just all brain, no heart. You've got, that
Yeah.
there's warmth, but there's also this not being like you're not being pulled around by your desires and aversions, that there's a
That's right.
steadiness that
There's
comes
an
with.
equanimity, a resilience, as the saying has it, you can walk evenly over uneven ground. Okay, those are the first three. And then on the basis of that, we kind of launch into the deep end of the pool. The remaining four ways of being that I turn into practices, they begin with, as you said, what I call being wholeness. So what do I mean by that? I mean essentially, and people can feel it as they listen here, what is it like to completely accept yourself? To not compartmentalize, different parts of your being and warding off many of them, to really accept yourself fully, to come home to yourself fully, while moving increasingly into a sense of being rather than being swept away continuously by doing. So that more and more the doing of the dishes or brushing the daughter's hair, or in my case, grinding out more emails every day, the doing is inside a feeling of being, which neurologically does lots of good stuff in your brain. And then increasingly, you start to get a sense of what I think of as level one non-dual experience, where it's experiential. In other words, you start to experience your mind in the broadest sense, not just intellect. That's a very small part of your mind as a whole. Your consciousness as a whole, in a non-dual way, as one whole moment in the streaming of consciousness that includes many parts continuously, right? And as you move more into this sense of wholeness, a lot of suffering falls away. A lot of inner conflict falls away. A lot of suppressing of different parts of yourself falls away. Everything's included. And there's less and less of the structure of suffering in your mind, which involves parts tussling with parts. So, and what happens with that as well is that a lot of sort of inner preoccupations disappear as you move into being wholeness. That's good.
This episode of A Healthy Curiosity is brought to you by the DIY version of Level Up Your Life. If you've fallen into some bad habits over quarantine, it is time for an upgrade. It's time to upgrade your nutrition, your rest, your movement, your meditation practice, and your mindset that you have the right to take care of yourself. Level Up Your Life gives you the structure, habit change strategy, and support you need to bridge the gap between what you know you need to be doing to take care of yourself and actually doing it. When you register for Level Up, you'll get a 6-month membership, which is enough time to go through all 10 modules twice. Or give yourself a few weeks on a habit that's particularly challenging and speed through the ones that you already have dialed in. In addition to the downloadable curriculum, you get 3 one-on-one laser coaching sessions with me, access to a group Q&A call once a month, and access to a members-only forum to stay connected to others who are taking steps in the direction of better. Visit brodywelch.com/level up by July 15th to save big. It sounds wonderful, and it also sounds like something that is not exactly fostered in the external world, right? Most of us have a lot of practice being in the judging mind, or being like in evaluating and criticizing, or being either in the past or the future instead of the present. And like, if we think about sort of yin yang theory is where I go with this, is that I talk a lot about yang addiction and how our society is so focused on the doing as opposed to the being. It's focused on the external as opposed to the internal. It's focused on the speed and the activity. It's as opposed to just the presence, and how we're kind of culturally conditioned to celebrate the doing over the being, but it's actually sort of like, but the being, if we can get into that eliminates the duality entirely. Like if we can strengthen and drop into, as you were talking about, that present moment totality and acceptance. It seems like I put acceptance in there. Is that right?
Yeah, I would put it in there. Certainly self-acceptance. And, in the book, and then I have this related online program that really gets experiential. In the book, I'm really interested in the power of fairly brief practices, which then we can develop over time. So, for example, as a brief practice, just notice what happens in your mind when you deliberately get a sense of your body as a whole with many sensations in it. Or what happens in your mind when you get a sense of the room you're in as a whole, or the larger physical space you're part of as a whole. Within seconds, certainly within a breath or 2 or 3, most people will experience a significant shift in their state of consciousness at the time. And typically it's a shift out of stressing and sort of contracted analysis.
I was just going to say the word expanded, like that. Yeah. That's what it feels like to me when I can get it, just expanding the perspective.
Yeah. Oof. And neurologically, neat things are happening in your brain that support that, which I go into detail in the book. But the experience is available to us. That's the sense of wholeness. When you move into your sense of your body as a whole, your state of consciousness as a whole, one way into that is to recognize visually the space you're in as a whole, as a kind of impersonal whole that you're part of. Boom, you immediately feel better. So anyway, that's great. And that's just an illustration of just, the ways in which little micro practices can have big, big effects, especially if you repeat them over time.
That's a pretty central practice in Qigong, where we are just that, if we think about the fact that you're an energetic field that's not separate from the energetic fields of everything around you, that beautiful. It's like that just abiding in that space, that there's like the sense of separate self goes away, the sense of interconnectedness kind of gets amplified.
Right.
So we get wholeness, which takes us out of duality a bit, and then
there you are. Yeah.
Then we get into nowness.
Yeah.
Tell us about how to be here now.
Exactly. Wouldn't you like to know, right? Inquiring
What's
minds,
the shortcut to being here now?
That's exactly right. So first, there's a place for imagining different futures and making plans and so forth. What would taste better tonight, Chinese food or, French fries or something. On the other hand, it's also useful to reflect on the past. What are the lessons to learn, or where's the hurt, right? Where's the ouch still in that weird conversation with your partner this morning or something like that? There's a place for that. But most people spend so much time in mental time travel in the future and the past. And so many of the great teachers, Ram Dass, bless him, passed away recently, be here now, right? The advice from his guru, or Eckhart Tolle talking about the power of now, or in various traditions, people refer to the eternal present. So, what is that about, right? And how do we, like you said, be here now? So, this is the fifth practice in the book, receiving nowness, increasingly resting in the felt sense of the continual updating of consciousness right at the front edge of now. As this moment arises, while letting it go and while becoming increasingly comfortable with the actual experience of impermanence, the radical transience of every moment of consciousness dissolving beneath our feet, even as the next moment of consciousness appears, right? How do we actually do that? So there's a lot of very neat neuroscience about it. And one of the key takeaways is that if we focus on the experience of, the term is alerting, something new has happened. The immediate first half second or so of experience. We don't necessarily know what something is or what to do about it. We just know that something has changed. Something has happened. There's a new sensation of breathing, or there's a new sound around us, or a new thought is arising, or the person we're talking with, let's say Brody, has just said something or just begun to say something, or she's just started to inhale to indicate that it's her turn to talk, right? Right there in the freshness of the arising moment. Well, if you train to be attentive to that feeling of updating, that feeling of alerting, that starts to engage a very ancient, neurologically ancient, evolutionarily ancient system of paying attention in your brain, so that more and more you're just resting there in that front edge of consciousness before suffering and fussing and feuding has had time to sink its roots into you.
And so, how does that inform? How can we use the brain science to practice this?
Yeah, it's kind of like I said, pay attention to the sense of being alerted to what's new and
Okay.
let go of needing to make sense of it, let go of planning about it, let go of connecting it to anything else as a practice. This is not the only way to live, right? But most of us have very little ability to really stay in the arising present for more than a few seconds in a row.
Oh, we're so tempted to judge it and make meaning out of it and
Exactly.
like
Exactly.
wedge it into a story that we've
Yeah. And
created.
manage it and solve it. And some of that is understandable, especially if you have a history of different kinds. My history is that, I make a living in a sense solving problems. So there you are. My mind's just, what's the problem? What's the problem?
And
Or
that
another
can,
person say has
yes.
just had a trauma history. They've had a lot of painful experiences and they're looking, what's the next threat? What's the next threat? What should I do about it? So it's understandable. But there's a loss of autonomy here. I mean, one of the fundamental underlying themes of this book, which is really about practice, it's about practice, especially deep practice. Um, the themes of autonomy, agency, in other words, who is the captain of your personal ship, right? Are you buffeted? Are you the puppet being pulled by the strings of the world around you and the arising of your own reactions from the past, right? Or is there more and more of a sense of actually being autonomous inside your own being, inside your own mind, that you have choice? You can choose to think about the future or reflect on the past if you want to, but you can also choose to be here now. And when you make that choice, you're successful at it, which goes to the second kind of running major theme in the book: skillfulness, competence, getting good at stuff, getting good at being here now, right? And appreciating that there are pitfalls and trying to get better at anything. Okay, fine. That said, don't fall into the pit and develop oneself in this way. So, yeah, we can absolutely become freer and more at choice and less swept away and more ourselves in the fullest, most beautiful sense. And one of the major ways to do that is to really learn how to receive nowness and hang out there.
It seems like the breath could be a really useful tool here. Like when I think about when I get
Mm-hmm.
out of nowness, when
Mm-hmm.
I'm triggered, right? Somebody says
Yeah.
something and I'm having a reaction to it, that that bringing myself back from that triggered, from that
Mm-hmm.
being activated into,
Yeah.
like when my nervous system starts to get hijacked by the past or by, perceiving threat, that coming back to the breath, because it is can be an anchor to the present moment.
I think the breath is a good anchor for the present moment. Some people are uncomfortable tuning into the breath, so it's important to mention to them that they can choose other objects of attention. But the breath is classic, right?
It's
Um,
convenient, right? Like it's
yeah,
always
it's
with us.
continually changing. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. Until the last one. Anyway, well, let me tell you about the next one,
Yeah,
opening
please.
into allness.
Hmm.
Yeah, this is where I'm trying to understand what's going on when people increasingly say, I kind of feel like I'm one with everything. I know there's the body here, and I understand that my body stops and your body begins, or the my hand ends and the doorknob begins. I mean, I get that, but basically, at a deeper level, I really feel some people say, one with everything. How do you actually do that, right? Or what's actually happening in the brain during these radical non-ordinary experiences in which suddenly the sense of the self just falls away, and meanwhile the world shines forth in radiant perfection. What is going on in the brain? What's going on in material reality when people are having those kind of experiences? So the opening into allness material explores what the underlying neurological basis is for the sense of ego, sense of self, and also what's the underlying neurological basis for less ego, less sense of self, while still feeling like a person who has needs and rights and responsibilities. And also, how can we soften the edges of the boundaries between ourselves and the world? So, this is the second kind of non duality, in the sense that the material universe is experienced as a single, non dual allness. And we start to experience ourselves in a beautiful way as a local quivering in the vast net of all the factors that make up reality moment by moment by moment. It's as if we recognize ourselves as a particular wave in the ocean, who, amidst other waves, as the local expression of the entire sea, whose nature all the while is water.
And what it sounds like you're describing is like a deep mystical experience, or maybe even experience of psychedelics, right? Like that when people feel like their ego self dissolves and they're part of all that is
Yeah.
without any separation. What is going on with the
Oh,
brain?
I want to step there.
Yeah.
So one way that people, and I've certainly done my share of psychedelics, one way that people do start having this sense of oneness or interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh puts it, in a very felt way. It can begin conceptually, but then it becomes increasingly really rested in the body sense. One way to do that is through psychedelics, but as Gurdjieff said, psychedelics are like a telescope. They show you what's possible, but then you need to walk there on your own. And in fact, most people who report these radical non-dual experiences, self-transcendent experiences are called, were not using drugs at the time. They sometimes were just having an ordinary day, stepping off a bus, right? And then suddenly, kaboom,
Right.
everything
This
opened up.
happy accident of
Yeah,
oneness or
yeah. So I
allness.
want to, I'm not anti psychedelics, entheogens, and all that sort of stuff, but they are, then you become dependent upon that method. And for me, what's really interesting is what are the residues they leave behind. Now, I
Yeah,
have known
absolutely.
people, absolutely, who've done very uh, profound guided experiences like psilocybin, things like that, and they're changed. I mean, it really made a difference for them. And that's what really counts, right? Not so much passing states, but lasting traits. But I'm interested in this chapter in particular with a nod to psychedelics. All right, what can we do on our own through our insight and our practice to gradually relax the sense of self with its contraction and possessiveness, my precious, right? How can we really relax the sense of self and more just have this beautiful sense that we're a local patterning of allness, you know, and allness abides. So I have a fundamental metaphor in the book of eddies in the stream. A thought is an eddy in the streaming of consciousness. A cloud is an eddy in the streaming of the atmosphere. The Milky Way galaxy is an eddy in the streaming of the universe. So for me, it's a matter of love the eddy, be the stream.
Love the eddy, be the stream. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. It's in Chinese medicine again, we think about the microcosm and the macrocosm, and that really that every part of the human body can be just it's a fractal, right? That we are this
That's a lovely way to
fractal
put it.
in the universe, and then within that we have these microsystems and at each level. So that idea of that the universe in the grain of sand,
exactly.
all of that. I know we're running short on time, so tell us about the last practice in the book.
It's the most ultimate one, finding timelessness. So that is an exploration of what in the Buddhist tradition is described really kind of opaquely, mysteriously as the unconditioned or unconditioned, unfabricated, undying, not subject to arising and passing away, and therefore a fundamental, reliable basis for the highest happiness. Because conditioned experiences are ultimately transient. They're all impermanent. They all pass away. That which is subject to arising is also subject to passing away. So, what in the world is that unconditioned? And there's a huge debate in many traditions around the world as to whether there's anything besides the natural universe. That's kind of where we started here, right? Is the ordinary Big Bang universe all there is, or because the ordinary Big Bang universe is conditioned, and the phenomena within it, the natural phenomena within it, are all conditioned. They're all subject to a passing away when their causes change. So, how do we find something that is meaningfully distinct from ordinary conditioned and therefore unreliable phenomena? Well, so that's what that part of the book is about. And the way I'll summarize it here is I think there are three kinds of unconditionality, if you will, three ways to relate to this material. First is to disengage increasingly from conditioned habits and increasingly open into and center oneself in what is effectively unconditioned. In other words, the field of awareness is effectively unconditioned because it can represent an infinite variety of conditioned phenomena. A blank sheet of paper is effectively unconditioned. It's a field of possibility, even though, we understand that the piece of paper is conditioned. It involved trees, manufacturing, someone figuring out how to make paper, blah, 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 right? So experientially, what this means more and more is you appreciate the eddies in the streaming of your consciousness and increasingly rest in and abide as awareness itself. Okay? That's one way to understand this deep material. And awareness itself starts to feel timeless because it's stable. It doesn't change. The contents of awareness change. Time passes in that sense, but awareness itself feels more and more rested in the eternal present. Second way to understand this unconditioned material is that it's referring to profound, extraordinary states of consciousness in which conditioned experiences fall away within ordinary reality, within the natural frame, with no reference to anything transcendental, no reference to anything divine, in other words. And I have friends and teachers who are incredible meditators who've had these remarkable experiences of the cessation, it's described as. And you can find comparable orientations to this sort of thing in Chan Buddhism, let's say, in China, or in other traditions around the world, Christian mysticism, deep Jewish contemplative practice, Sufism, the native people, the first people, indigenous traditions around the world. You can find analogs to this where people do deep, deep, deep meditative practice and the mind stops. And one way to understand that is that, it's an extraordinary event in ordinary reality. God is not involved. Okay, That's the second way we can relate to this stuff. And I'm okay with that. I'm fine. Someone wants to stop there. Maybe they're a, deep-dyed atheist. Okay, no worries. And then there is a third way to approach this question of what could be ultimately unconditioned. And that's where we start looking at what transcends ordinary reality, which in my view, the Buddha did point to. In my view, the great saints and sages throughout history have generally pointed to what lies beyond ordinary reality. And they ascribe different qualities to it. The Buddha kept it pretty simple. He really focused on just that sense of infinite possibility and timelessness, not arising and passing away. Others ascribe consciousness to ultimate reality, something like consciousness, even woven into the fabric of the material universe, and even perhaps the quality of love, benevolence somehow as an attribute of the transcendental. So I explore these in the book, these different ways of relating to that material without trying to preach at people or force anything down their throats, and also explore what could be going on in the brain in the classic run-up to nirvana, to nibbana, as it's described in the Pali tradition. So that chapter is the deepest of the deep end of the pool, finding timelessness. And for me, it's one of my favorite chapters because it really, really goes after the ultimate questions, but does so in a way that I think respects these distinctions and does mark the distinction between natural phenomena, even extraordinary natural phenomena like these profound revelations that people can experience meditatively, and what ultimately, and for me, it is part of my own personal practice and belief that there really is a divine, there really is a transcendental, and how to become increasingly accessible to it, increasingly transparent to it, increasingly, as it were, loving the eddies, being the stream of time passing, flowing through the banks of timelessness.
So beautiful. And I can't wait to get to that chapter on my
Yeah.
own. So, by means of bringing this back down to earth into people's daily lives,
Yeah.
if people are interested in playing around with some of this stuff for even just a few minutes a day, where would you have them start?
That's a great question. And I want to again stress the point that for me, it falls short. We let our friends and students down if we don't talk about the upper third, quarter, tenth of human potential. What is actually possible for us in this life? And
Oh, I
while we may
so
not,
appreciate you saying that. Yes, like it
absolutely,
doesn't have to be limited. Like that
yeah,
we can look at all that's possible in the human experience, and if it's possible for one person with
yes,
attention and cultivation, it's possible for all of us.
exactly right. And even if we don't make it all the way to the peak of Mount Everest, we can appreciate those who've gone that far, and that there's a route to the top, and and the next step is worth taking. That's the crux. The next step is worth taking. So I love your question. I would say that over the course of a single meditation, probably at least half an hour long, a person could genuinely tap into the feeling of each of these 7 ways of being. Let's start with steadiness. I think they form a natural sequence, which is why I put them in that order. If you want, you can bounce around, but there's a natural flow. Steady your mind, open your heart, rest at ease. Good. You got the first 3 going right there. It's kind of like plates spinning.
Yeah.
Or getting sort of instruments playing and the song going in your mind, right? So we have steadiness, lovingness, and fullness. Get that going. And then start to bring in a sense of being whole, tuning into the feeling of your body as a whole, really accepting yourself, and widening, I think you used the word expanding, your sense of consciousness to include all of yourself, just moment after moment. Increasingly rested in the emergent present nowness. So there you are, steadily, lovingly, calmly, wholly present, letting go continuously while also receiving continuously. That's nowness. With a growing intuition that whatever you're experiencing right now as the mind-body process, what's happening in your body, and on the basis of it, what's happening in awareness, what's happening in your mind. Right here is a local quivering, a local enactment, literally, of the entire universe, reaching out into life on planet Earth, the ways in which we're living beings. We inhale the exhalations of green growing things. We exhale to what they inhale, as it were, right? We are breathing stardust, literally oxygen and nitrogen, carbon, built in the heart of a star, usually as it exploded over many billions of years in our universe. We are stardust. Our bodies are billions of years old in terms of the atoms, besides hydrogen, essentially, that comprise them. So you feel that. And then, on the basis of that, a growing intuition of mystery. What lies always just before the emergent present? What's the field of possibility always just before emergent actuality? Or you might have, if a person has a religious practice, perhaps a spiritual practice, to really bring that in. So there can be a growing sense of two things together: ordinary experiences passing through time with an underlying intuition of timelessness, of vastness, of the absolute. That's accessible. That's accessible to people. It's a little ambitious, but why not go for it, right?
I really appreciate you really believing in the potential for people to be able to do this, because I agree that that with practice, things that seem extraordinary become much more doable. And
Yeah.
that,
And if
and
someone were to do that, if someone were to just follow that out, just kind of take a little time with what I said right there, maybe, or just roll with it for the 3 to so minutes I spoke at, notice that it helps you function better in your life. You're less uptight. You're less stressed. You worry less. You're more in the present. Your heart's more open. You're more available to other people. You're softer in your footprint on other people. It's extremely useful in everyday life to cultivate these 7 qualities inside oneself.
well, this has been such a privilege to be taken on this journey into some of your teachings. And I so appreciate you sharing so generously from your new book, Neurodharma, which I encourage everyone to check out. It's just been a real pleasure. So thank you so much.
Oh, Brody, it's a pleasure to talk with you and practice with you. And I'll just mention that if people want to engage this material in a particularly experiential way, they should check out this online version of it I have, in which I taught a 10-day meditation retreat. We recorded the meditations and my talks and a lot of bonus material, and it's a really nice package that is very inexpensive. And also, it's available to people with financial need. We have a lot of scholarships for it as well. So, you can find out both of those things on my website, rickhansen.net. And the underlying point here is that what we practice grows, right? And if we practice resentment and regret, well, that's going to grow. On the other hand, if we practice steadiness, lovingness, fullness, and so forth, that's going to grow inside us as well.
Great place to leave it. We will make sure that all of those links are in the show notes. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. And thanks again to my guest, Rick Hansen. Thanks for listening today. To check out the show notes, get on my email list, or drop me a line, head to brodywelch.com. That's Brody with an IE and Welch with a CH. I'd love to hear from you. If you learned something new or feel inspired to try something different in your life, I'd love for you to pay it forward by sharing this episode with a friend who you think could also benefit, and give them a reason to listen. You'll be helping to create a world where we encourage each other to embody self-respect. Till next time, be good to yourself.